on common approaches to the existence of God. And this might possibly take us more than one class period, this particular lesson. And that'll be fine. We've got a couple weeks built in, so that would be fine if it did. I've got so much material here in my mind. Brother Moyer has his PhD in philosophy and a master's in apologetics. I believe that's right. But my favorite arguments for the existence of God are mainly philosophical. I mean, I read science some, and I enjoy it when I can understand it. But I think to me, this is me personally. This is not some guys like science, and that's great. But to me, just to fashion an argument and then answer the argument, to me, philosophically is where I go. Now, some guys don't like philosophy because sometimes it gets really weighted down in words and definitions and all that sort of thing. And so you have to be sort of a language person to like philosophy anyway. And I like languages. So, but anyway, so fortunately for me, the reason I mentioned all this is because his background, Doyle's background, is philosophy, and I mean he's a good science guy too, but his background is philosophy, and so he writes in the same way that I like to talk, so, or in the same way that I like to teach it, I should say. So before we begin, we want to go to God in a word of prayer, and I'm going to ask Ron Carr, would you lead us in a word of prayer?
I sure will.
Oh, I don't want to embarrass anybody if they happen to be stepped away from their computer or something. Are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time that we have to come together and study a portion of your word, Father. We pray that Bill would have a good recollection of the things that we are studying tonight, and pray that it would make us better Christians, Father. So thank you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Okay, so looking at this lesson, and again, as he points out toward, I think somewhere toward the end of this reading of his chapter 17 or lesson 17 here, this is sort of a thumbnail sketch again of the basic approaches to talking about the existence of God. I mean, there are other arguments. In fact, I would have preferred to have had a section on the ontological argument for the existence of God, but that's just me. Again, that's all personal preference. It's something I know that he's well aware of. The important thing to understand is there's no way to prove God. You understand that, right? I mean, you can't, in the sense of coming up with a mathematical equation, 2 + 2 = 4. We know that, but God can't be seen. He can't be touched. He doesn't have, in the sense of, any empirical ways of seeing God and feeling him, tasting him, smelling him, or anything along that line. So we do have, though, evidence for his existence, and it's a cumulative thing. Now, again, the proof, now, when I say there's no proof for God, the proof is in Jesus Christ and his resurrection. And do you notice that in 1 John 1, how the writer how John begins that epistle in 1 John 1? Listen to what he says. He's making the very point that I've just tried to make to you when he says in 1 John 1, beginning at verse 1, He said that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, that's an empirical sense, which we have seen, there's number 2, which we have looked upon and have touched, there's 3, with our hands concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it, and testified to and proclaimed to you eternal life, which was with the Father made manifest to us. So, the proof of God is in Jesus, in his resurrection and all of the things that he did and so forth. So what I'm just saying is that, but with some people who don't even believe in God, you have to start somewhere with them. And generally it's whatever presuppositions they're coming with. Just realize that some people don't want to believe in God. I'm sorry to say, they just don't want to believe. I mean, I had a brother that was raised the same as I was and got to the point where he didn't believe in God. And I talked to him about everything from everything that we've gone through, these 17 lessons. I talked to him about at some point or another. And maybe 2 or 3 at a time, we talked, and finally I just looked at him and I said, I've answered every one of your arguments, but that hasn't changed you. Why don't you just say, I don't want to believe, and I'd have more respect for you. I mean, the reason he doesn't believe in God is he doesn't want to. That's the bottom line. So sometimes you're going to meet people like that. And then sometimes you're going to meet people that all they've ever heard, they've never really read the Bible for themselves. They've just heard sort of pejorative statements about people who believe in God and that they're irrational, or that it's like believing in Santa Claus or blah, blah, blah. It's that sort of thing. And there's no real substance. So one of the things, and I'm answering a question here that comes up in this lesson a couple different ways, but here's one of the answers to those questions. It is the basis for showing that there is a rational belief, or basis for belief, I should say. There's a rational basis for belief, that we're justified for having a rational belief in God. And so, again, what I would say about science and the Bible, or science and religion, there is no clash between science and religion, or science and the Bible. It's only when the man of the Bible becomes unbiblical, or the man of the science becomes unscientific, that there's a clash. And so that's the only time that there's any problem with science and religion. It's interesting that I would say in our day and time, there are just a lot of scientists that are believers that really have shunned. I would say since the early 80s, especially, that this has manifested itself, that there were a lot of guys that believed in God or believed in intelligent design. They may not necessarily say who God is, but they recognize by the examination of science, whether it's biology or whether it's applied science, whether it's whatever it is, that they recognize that there's something beyond this world in which we live, that there's intelligence behind it. So I really think that there is a lot of that. Now, the sad thing is, the reason that it always sounds like there's nobody that believes that are scientists is because the universities hold a lot of pressure, unless it's a religious, like Faulkner or Florida College or something like that. But in major universities, they hold a lot of pressure on them to teach Darwinism and that sort of thing, and to eschew the idea of God. And of course, we're seeing the fruits of all of this today. Do you not realize that this thing about getting rid of Dr. Seuss and Mr. Potato and all that sort of ridiculous stuff grows out of just a moral relativism, and that truth is true for you and whatever you want it to be. And we're going to talk about that in this lesson some, and why I think the moral argument for the existence of God is a really good argument, by the way. I think all of these are good arguments to show a rather uh, justified, rational belief in God. Any comments on anything I've said? Feel free to jump in. This should create some discussion, I hope. We've got a lot of smart people here at Perry Hill Road, and I know that I'd be interested in your experiences and your thoughts. So don't hesitate to jump in if something strikes you or something is said, or if I say something that you disagree with. Feel free. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time I was wrong. We'll probably
Bill,
yes.
We've talked about this somewhat in previous sessions, but I think that there is a mindset, which unfortunately is sometimes shared by religious people, or it's easy to slide into it, that we need to discuss things that are not religious in a way that is, quote, neutral to religion, and that, well, the agnostic point of view is the more neutral one. And if that makes sense, in other words, we have to assume a naturalistic stance on things if we're outside of the sphere of religion. And, in some respects, if you're just talking about, how wounds heal on your skin or something, you don't have to get into, God's part in that, I suppose. But when we give up that ground, we create that assumption. I think it fosters that feeling that like everybody in sciences must be an atheist because they don't talk about it.
Yeah. Well, thankfully, there are some really good books out there. A really good book I'd recommend, and you can buy it secondhand, called "The Intellectuals Speak Out Against God." It was written in the '80s, and it's got Jakey and Jastrow and a number of other well-known scientists, astronomers and it does the sciences, it does the moral stuff, and it does the philosophical stuff in the book. And it's a really good read. They all wrote different essays, and so they're not extremely long. And some of you'll just want to bypass because you think, well, I'm never going to run into somebody like this, and you probably won't. But there's some, C.S. Lewis has an article in there, I think. It's a reprint, but nonetheless. So, yeah, I think you're right, Gary, but I do think they're being more vociferous now. I mean, Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, Dembski is the other one for intelligent design. So some of them are coming up. Now, I'll tell you, we'll talk about intelligent design too, but while they've done some good work, they're, what should I say? I'm sure in their personal life they do profess some kind of specific belief about God. But when you're talking about intelligent design, you're just arguing that there is a God. Now, who it is, they don't know. That's not their, in a sense, it really isn't their purview. And so they sort of stay away from it. They're trying to be scientists who believe in God without trying to, I don't know, use biblical language, I guess. I don't know. So it's always kind of a tension there. They're trying to, in some way, justify a rational belief in God, but at the same time be politically correct. In some way, I think that's probably what they're trying to do. Because they all teach at major universities, like I said, and they have to kind of walk of course, those guys don't have to worry about it anymore. But anyway, yeah, that's an interesting point that we, and I don't think that we, especially in the church, there's almost an anti-intellectual approach, and that's how they discount scientists, they're just educated beyond their means. And that's not fair. I mean, I really respect people who are highly educated and who maintain their feet on the ground and serve God and are faithful. There's a lot of our brethren that are, but they're, I just remember growing up, I think, and in that era when I grew up, that there was sort of an anti-intellectual, anti-scientific sort of thing. And so anyway, they combated each other from those extremes. Any comments or questions? We'll go to the first question. So what are strengths and weaknesses of arguments for God's existence that focus on scientific and moral issues? What are some of the strengths and weaknesses? However you want to, you start with whatever one you want or mix them up, whatever. Anybody got any? And, again, these are questions that we would need to read Doy's stuff to have a discussion about them. So you may have some other thoughts about them. So feel free to say something different. The first thing I would say is that the Bible never makes an argument for the existence of God. I mean, it just presupposes that God exists. And so they never make that argument. And so having then the will to believe becomes necessary for evidence to be convincing. I think that's why there's no evidence that actually proves God in the sense of 2 + 2 = 4, or in some kind of mathematical equation of some sort that would, we could be certain that this is the answer. But then what happens is, while the Bible never makes that argument for the existence of God, it points to certain things, and then we have to have the will to believe it is necessary, or we have to have the will to believe. Actually, and I'm going to tell you, in these answers I'm giving you, these are just my short notes, and so I didn't even write them in sentence. These are just the notes I'm going to talk to you about and from off of. So having the will to believe is necessary for evidence to be convincing. And what I'm saying about that is that, if you come with the presupposition that faith is irrational, it is subjective, it is foolish, well, there's nothing going to convince you. But here, having the will to believe is not the same as believing. But I want to believe whatever the truth is, whatever is more logical. And so what you're doing when you're looking at these arguments are weighing evidence. Is it more, based on what this argument is saying, is it more reasonable to believe it, or is it a foolish argument? Is it silly? Throw it out. And so that's what we're weighing. So the strengths and weaknesses for the arguments for the existence of God are partly that. Cumulative evidences may lead us in the direction of God, but again, we cannot prove God in the sense of a mathematical equation. So there is strength to them. I mean, it does show that there is a reasonable, rational basis for believing. I think that's the strength, because these are all legitimate arguments. These are things that people can understand. These are things that people can see. But there are people that can't see it because they don't want to see it. So you just have to kind of move on there.
Hey, Bill.
Yes, please, feel free, jump in.
Yeah, so one of the weaknesses of arguing on the basis of science that there is a God is science, in a sense, is on a movable scale. If we, ask somebody from the 1400s, hey, what's the smallest living thing? They're probably going to look to an ant or, something like that. Now we know about atoms and protons and neutrons. So you have this sense of, oh, let me point to this here. And then, 50, 20, 30 years later, there's something greater that we didn't even know about, just like, I think it's in Job when he talks about, God set, the earth on its pillars. And, obviously nobody had been to outer space. Nobody knew about that. But we now know that, there's poles and there's magnetic poles, which again, put to a string, but you can't base it on something that's constantly moving, constantly changing, even though it points you further into God. You just can't make it a firm argument.
Yeah. Well, what was I don't remember who said it, and I probably won't get this entirely correct, but if you get married to the science of today, you're going to be a widow tomorrow, because as you said, it is not a closed system. It's ever changing. You use the one about the axis, on the pillars. There's also another one in Job that God hung in the north. There's an empty space. Well, if you and I standing here on the ground look out to the north, there's an empty space. But if you get Hubble's helped us realize that there's a whole nother galaxy out there. And so we have to understand how the Bible is written as well. And that is, it's written in the common everyday language of men. I mean, literally, the sun doesn't rise and set. I mean, scientifically, that's not an accurate explanation, but that's how we talk, isn't it? And so we need to take that into consideration, that somebody can't say, well, the sun doesn't rise and set. That's what the Bible is just talking about how we see things. That's one of the dangers, I think, sometimes of using, and we just have to be cautious in using them, pre-scientific statements of the Bible that I'm not sure that's what the writer had in mind. But anyway, we speak in those terms and see those things. And so we just have to be careful on both sides of the thing. As you said, science is not a closed system, and it is constantly moving. And I think there's a point I'm making here somewhere that, science, there's a lot that science knows, but there's a whole lot more it doesn't know. So that's important too. Anything else anybody wants to add to this part of the discussion? Jump in there, say something. Okay. So how can these arguments open doors for further study and discussion? This is such a great time to talk about this. I mean, we have a heavy emphasis about doing personal evangelism. And, you are going to run into people that say, well, I've never really thought about God, and I'm not sure if he exists. So, how can these arguments open doors for further study and discussion? I know sometimes when we think about evidences or talk about evidences and talk about arguing with somebody on the existence of God, that sounds like such a heavy subject. And it can be, but it's not necessarily. You know what? I mean, most of the people you and I know, they've never really thought about it. And so some of these will help lead them to God. It will help them, as I said, see a basis on which we can be justified for a rational and reasonable belief in God. So I think they can focus the discussion on a rational and objective basis. That's one of the things I had. And that's to say that belief in God can be rationally justified. That's all I mean by that. Sometimes they'll say, well, you guys just believe in faith and science doesn't believe in faith. Yes, they do. Yeah, they do. Faith is just as essential to life as breathing is. Everybody believes something. So what's the basis for believing? That's the question. And that's what these arguments help with, is to show the basis for believing. That's a comment up here somebody has.
No, I was just, Bill, one of the things this is John. The one things that I'm worried about walking down that road is that even a rational basis of science changes from age to age or generation to generation. I mean, who would have ever thought that there would be a segment of population that, despite everything they see in the sky, thinks the earth is flat, or that you can have more than one gender, or that you could, there's just that a fetus is, instead of being an age of a child, it's just a scientific term of a non-ageless form. I mean, it's just like a toddler, a baby, a fetus. It's all talking about the age range of something, but now they don't even want to acknowledge that. So they change meanings. And so it's a very it's a very tricky discussion to have, especially if you're talking with younger people about science. I mean, even the things that are solid are not solid anymore when it comes to science. So it's very difficult.
Yeah, so that's why I said to you in the beginning that I really like the moral argument for the existence of God and the ontological argument. Of course, that's more deeper philosophically, and I know that's why Doy didn't put it in here. But
I do think that if you could do it objectively without emotion, you don't get frustrated, that
Yeah.
people will respect that a lot and they'll listen to you. But it's hard. Sometimes you just want to shake somebody, go, this is 2 + 2 is 4. It's not 8. Come on.
yeah.
So,
And that's even true in any discussion, though. That's not getting frustrated with people because they don't see it the same way we see it. When it comes to, talking with somebody that's in another denomination and they don't see it. We all wonder why people can't understand he that believeth is baptized shall be saved. That's pretty straight up. But then I remember that Paul and the Jews, Paul had the same frustration himself, and himself wasn't for a long time a disbeliever. And, if you were raised in a particular way for 3,000 years like they were and their ancestors and all that, and it would be hard to change, And so, people have grown up and this is all they've ever known and believed, and their grandparents knew it and their dad. Aside from the emotional side of that, just from just a pure objective looking at what they're coming from, I can see why it's hard for them. And so I just remind myself of that. So anyway, yeah, some good discussion here. Anybody got anything else? All right. Yeah, go ahead.
It's Megan.
Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to say, C.S. Lewis makes a good argument for the moral discussion.
Yeah.
As in Mere Christianity, like the whole first book, which I think they were like speeches that he gave that turned into that book. But anyway, the first book of Mere Christianity, he talks about, if you go back and you compare all of these older civilizations, like ancient Egyptians and Babylonians and all these other things, they basically all had, in a sense, the same morality, because it's all judged up against the same basic standard. So when somebody says, well, I don't believe in right and wrong, they're going to turn around a minute later and contradict that, because if you do something, like if you enter a contract with them or something, and then you go against that contract, they're going to say, well, you wronged me, because there's this basic understanding of right and wrong. And so, some religions may disagree on how many wives you can have, but they all agree with the basic morality that you can't have any woman you want or any man that you want, because there is this overall basic standard.
Okay.
That's all. But it's a good,
Well,
there's way too much information in there to summarize it in a paragraph, but it's a very good defense of the moral argument.
Yeah, well, C.S. Lewis is probably is the one responsible for bringing that argument really to the fore. And I think to me, like you said, it's a good argument, I think, to make. And we'll talk some more about it in a minute. Anybody have anything else they want to add to what Megan said or John has said, or something different? Okay. So can you define the basic cosmological argument? Obviously I forgot to set that up, but so I'm going to kind of do a little fix here on this. Pretend you didn't see this. I thought I already had this set up, but where's my animation?
Basically, if you had a cause, and the fact there had to be a cause for it.
That's correct. That's exactly right. It's the cause and effect argument that we have. So let me go back to this now. Okay. All right. So you have the creation, and this really isn't a proof of this isn't really an answer. This is leading to the answer that Ollie just gave. The creation psalms, such as Psalms 8, Psalms 19, and there are several others, or Romans 1:18, are really basically cosmological arguments. I mean, they're the heavens declare the handiworks of God. For what is man thou art mindful of him? Psalms 8, Romans 1 verse 18, they are without excuse, that you can look around and see and so forth. And so how is that proving? Well, that's what Ollie said. It's having cause and effect. And it's a little bit similar to the teleological argument, but the teleological argument is more about design, but it still has to do with cause and effect, and we'll see that in a minute. So why is there something rather than nothing, cause and effect, which is the point that Sister Ollie was making. So, I mean, why are we here? How did this get here? Why isn't there nothing? I mean, why is there something rather than nothing? And so you have to ask that question. I mean, if you're going to say God doesn't exist. So, I mean, you have possibilities. I mean, obviously Darwin would have said evolution, but then where does evolution come from? I mean, you go back and begin to regress into, ultimately you're going to have to get back somewhere to the beginning, which is also another interesting point to the cosmological argument. You have to start at a beginning, that the earth had a beginning. And so Genesis 1 says what? In the beginning. And so even now science begins to recognize that there is a beginning. Thomas makes the point that part of the problem with the science argument is the fact that science is the collection of human disciplines that deal with our knowledge of the material universe, heat, motion, chemistry, etc. God, by definition, yes, he's those. And Thomas's point here is it comes up in the lesson later. These are contingent things. God is a necessary being, by definition, exists beyond that limitation. While the operation of the universe can point to God, the understanding of that operation doesn't tell us anything about God except that he is orderly. And that comes up again too. The idea of order comes up in the teleological argument for God, as we were just talking about. So good comments, great comments from me. Thank you for your comments. That's an inside joke. But anyway, so we think about why we're here, or what we see before us. And then science, and this goes back to, again, this ties into what Thomas just said. This goes back to what John DeMoss said, as well as, and that started with what Charlie said. Science is not a closed system. It knows much, but there is much more it doesn't know. So consider the fact that the universe is ever expanding. If it's expanding, I mean, you have to think about this. If it's expanding, it had to start somewhere. It points to a beginning. And that's the expanding. And I think, let's see, where is that? He talks about that in this lesson. The 2 points of evidence help us to argue in the direction of the universe had a beginning. First, the universe is expanding, which implies a point in time when it must have begun. I mean, science will tell you that we're expanding. Of course, there are some variations on that people would use to try to, they're just trying to erase God out of the picture. But there's no scientific proof for their theory or their explanation. So the expansion of the universe in and of itself denotes a beginning. Now, again, you and I don't have a problem with it, because we read Genesis 1 verse 1 says, in the beginning. So there is a beginning. We know who the beginning is God. That is, that God started from the beginning. Then second, there is this argument from Entropy, or the second law of thermodynamics, that everything is tending toward greater disorder. And as he describes it, processes that occur within a closed system tend toward a state of equilibrium or decay. That's the entropy. With no energy being fed into the system, everything would eventually burn up and wear out. So how does this help the believer's cause? Well, the question is simple. If given enough time, the universe would burn out, that is, reach what they refer to as heat death, then why hasn't it already happened if it did not have a beginning? Assuming that the universe is infinite, it should have already burned out. Yet here we are. Here, unbelievers must propose a model that is neither scientifically provable nor observed anywhere. And so the universe is not and cannot be eternal. So, but that's what we have there. Anybody have any comments or questions that they want to ask about this?
Just some things that always impress me with my background as a navigator. When you look at the stars at night, and they are just, there's no way, of course, to count the stars. There's actually more stars than there are sands on the earth.
Wow.
And we think of our time and our accurate watches, and but all watches.
Yeah, it's
England. Well, Greenwich, England sets that time
you're cutting
from
in and out
the
on
stars. Every clock we have is measured by the stars, and it's precisely the same always. For navigation, I could be out over the Atlantic at 40,000 feet in the middle of the Atlantic, but I could open my star book, 20 or 30 different stars that you could pick from. You try to pick them 120 degrees apart, which give you the most accuracy. But the book would measure for any exact time exactly the elevation above the horizon and the azimuth of the stars. And you measure that, and you from an assumed position on the map, you mark those three measurements, and in the middle of that triangle is where you are. And it was just exactly because everything in the universe moves exactly the same.
That's amazing. I mean, thinking about being 40,000 feet and being able to figure out exactly where you are. And of course, obviously the mariners use it, the ancient mariners use it as well. I always think about Paul being shipped out in the sea for a fortnight, 14 days without being able to see the stars or sun. I mean, don't you know those guys were really scared to death, because that's how they figured out where they were. And they had no clue where they were. And so, yeah, that would be
and you take motion in that as well. I was flying at 600 to maybe 1,200 miles an hour, and the Earth itself is rotating at 1,000 miles an hour, and no telling how fast it's moving around the sun.
Man. Yeah, that's just, those things are just so awe-inspiring to me.
Bill,
Yes, please.
think about those stars Brother John just mentioned, more than the sand on the earth, and the Lord counts them and names every one of them according to Psalm 147.
Yeah. I always think about
My wife just reminded me that my crew would never follow me on the ground.
well, yeah, and I think about sometimes, when I'm just at a specific sightseeing place and looking at stars at night or something, I think about the fact that, we're looking at the same stars that Abraham looked at. And it's just, to me, it's just always impressive. And God named some of the constellations in the book of Job and so forth. I mean, those have been around a long time.
Hey, Bill, you mentioned the law of thermodynamics. Well, there's another law that says energy is not created or destroyed, just transferred in phases. So think about all the energy that had to be at the beginning of creation in order to have these stars that are numerous as the sand. And then those stars are bigger than our sun. Think about all that energy that had to be. It would be ridiculous to think that came from an explosion of nothing into that much energy. It's unfathomable.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that is a lot of energy. Okay. Let's see, where am I? Oh, I got 5 minutes. Well, let's finish this question. Let's see. So, how do you think the arguments can be used in discussion with others? I have something greater than this universe exists. That is that, for all of this to be, as John just described, both Johns just described, John Birch, John DeMoss described. I mean, somebody, as you said, it just can't happen by chance, and everything be in such a fixed position, and be able to get your location and all that sort of thing. And so, however this came about, something greater than what is there created or brought that into existence. I mean, I'm just talking as if of course, I know it's God, but I'm just saying, you'd have to say that something greater than this universe exists. And so God is a necessary, not a contingent being, as evidenced when he said to Moses at the burning bush, I am, meaning I always have been, I always will be, and I am, I'm here. And so, somebody said, well, who created God? God didn't have to be created. He is, I am. As Doyle points out in this somewhere in one of these, he's the first cause, and he always has been. And it's the bottom of page 45A. He suggests that the universe had a beginning, and is it not reasonable to believe that something greater than the material universe, one who is not contingent, dependent on something else, but is necessary, does not depend on anything else, created it? And that's the argument. So, one could, as he points out, could start out saying, well, it happened here. Well, then, okay, where did that come from? And ultimately, the regress comes all the way back to the first cause, and that's God. Anybody have anything else on this? Anybody have any questions they want to ask about anything we've covered so far tonight? Make any comments? I think I'm going to stop there rather than start the next one, because I think that's the moral argument. Yeah, no, that's the theological argument. That's a long, so I'll just start that one Sunday and see how far we get. But go ahead and read the next lesson on naturalism and Darwinism. And I don't know if we'll get to it, but it won't make any difference if we do or don't. But just read it in case we get to a couple questions in there about it. And read this material again. If you've already read it, read it again. And if you have a question and you want to ask a question, what a word means or something, or what this means, or what's an example of that, then write it down, and we'll talk about it Sunday, or whenever you have those kind of questions. Are always welcome. So I'll give you a couple minutes where we'll be way ahead of who's teaching, because I guess you could be teaching remotely, huh? Trying to get out of this stop share. There we go. Yeah. So I'm done. Okay. So,
stop
okay.
the live stream.